While large corporate brands in South Africa have woken up to social media, following in their footsteps of their customers. According to the South African Social Media Landscape Study for 2012, 95% of major corporations surveyed have some form of social media strategy aimed at consumers, and most companies want to invest in training their staff to best utilize social media platforms. Joining us for more on this now is Arthur Goldstack. He's MD at Worldwide Works. Thanks so much, Arthur, for joining us today.
Good afternoon.
Well, let's start off with what actually constitutes a social media strategy for any corporate in South Africa, because only 51% rate Facebook, for example, as effective, and 33% are effective on Twitter. So what constitutes a strategy, an effective strategy?
Firstly, what we have to understand is that those who don't find it effective tend to be those who aren't using it effectively. So it's not Facebook per se that doesn't work for them, but rather the way they present themselves on Facebook. And most South African companies are on Facebook. So if you have a Facebook presence, a Twitter presence, or a YouTube presence, you basically have a social media strategy. But in many cases, it's a strategy for the sake of having a strategy. So they're saying, let's be on Facebook because we're expected to be there, rather than let's have a look at what it can do for our business or for our brand. And generally speaking, social media is a brand issue. So if you want to build your brand or reinforce the values of your brand, you would have a strong social media strategy and presence. If you're not strictly speaking concerned about brand building, then you're probably going to have a very poor presence.
Arthur, you know, that sort of preempts my question. You know, does Anglo American PLC need to say we've just dug a load more iron ore out the ground and some coal as well, we've done better than we did last month, and stick that on Twitter or Facebook? Or do they just need to ignore it? Whereas on the other hand, does Checkers need to say we've got a special on pork chops this week, and therefore blitz the social media sphere with it? I mean, there must be certain companies for which social media is a boon, and for other companies it's absolutely unnecessary.
You have hit the nail on the head in terms of the kind of company that needs to engage with certain kinds of social media. So for some companies, YouTube, for example, is a perfect medium. 2/3 of corporates use YouTube in one way or another, but some should rather stay away from YouTube because it's such a visual and moving medium. So if you're in groceries, then unless you have a very clever video ads, for example, YouTube's not going to work for you. But if you have a large customer base that's expecting to engage with you in Facebook or Twitter in particular, then you had better be there, because if you're not, your customers are going to guide the conversation about your brand and you've got no role in it. And that's really what it comes down to as an entry-level social media strategy.
Yeah, when it comes to developing that strategy, though, you know, the focus is just how focused your strategy is in the first place, and you know, whether or not you're getting it right, you know, making it work for you. And the commentary is that much of corporate South Africa is still feeling their way. Is corporate South Africa simply waking up too late?
No, it's never too late. It's too late if you don't wake up at all. The way I've put it is that they've woken up, but they're not yet dressed for the day. And they're not quite sure how to get dressed. But at the very least, if you're there, if you're watching what people are doing, that's the starting point. You're at least awake. And I remember 4 years ago telling companies that's the minimum that they have to do, is monitor what people are saying about you. Today it's not enough to just monitor it. That's a strategy, as I said, from 3-4 years ago. And now you really have to be there and engage with your customers. And it's a very overused word, engagement, but that is actually the key to social media.
What is the most effective social media for a corporate? I mean, I know corporate covers a multitude of evils, but let's broaden it and just say, okay, corporate South Africa, you're a company, you haven't got a social media presence. Which one do you choose? I mean, you've listed here Facebook. I understand Facebook, but I'm not on Facebook. Twitter, I understand Twitter, but I am. Mixit, I always thought was sort of a little teen thing where kids chat to each other. LinkedIn, that's more corporate to me. Pinterest and Foursquare, which one would you choose if you had to?
If you're a restaurant, then Foursquare is a great social network to use. If you're not in the business of bringing customers in off the street and having people tell all their friends where they are and inviting them to that venue, and that particularly applies to restaurants, then rather stay away from Foursquare. It's a very new one, and it's very effective in markets where there's a huge base of users, and in this country that doesn't really apply. Pinterest works for brands that are very visual and that can present their products or services in a still image manner, in other words, with a photo or a graphic in this very visual environment. Heavily populated by women compared to men, so fashion and food, for example, is going to go down better than others. But again, it's a chance for brands to actually differentiate themselves by being different on Pinterest. You don't have to be what everyone else is being. Those are the niche newcomers, you could say. But in other areas, like Twitter, for example, there's no company that shouldn't be on Twitter, because their customers are all on Twitter. And you need to be where your customers are. Same applies to Facebook. But Mixit is the interesting one, because as you say, the impression is that it's teenagers, but in fact the user base has grown up, and at least half the users are now adults, or at least over 16, perhaps over 18 as well. And that's a bigger user base than the adults on Facebook, for example. There are 9.5 million active users on Mixit, and that user base tells you that businesses that aim at a younger market, not a teenage market necessarily, but a youth market or a young adult market, should be in Mixit. And yet only 20% of corporates are actually using Mixit.
Of course, you know, the major incentive for any corporate in whichever sector to be investing in anything is boils down to return on investment at the end of the day. How do you measure the return on investment to be reaped from venturing down this path? Because there's a distinction to be made between volume and value.
Well, it's interesting that that's not really what is being looked for. What's being looked for is what is the benefit we can get in general, not necessarily a measurable return on investment. And when we ask people, what is your main reason, or is this one of your key reasons, what proportion responds to each of those reasons, then public relations and marketing come out top. Mm-hmm. And you can't really measure return on investment in those areas. A fairly small proportion compared to those, but big in general, is lead generation. In other words, they're looking for sales opportunities. Around 40% of companies are using it for that purpose, and they can measure return on investment directly. Mm-hmm. But it's very rare that that's the only purpose of using social media. Generally speaking, it's brand building, communication, public relations, and marketing.
Arthur, we've got to be very careful as well, of course. Social media is not going to go anywhere. It's only going to grow, of course, because we're natural communicators as human beings. But it's a double-edged sword as well. Is there any danger that if you misuse the social media sphere by bombarding people with too much stuff, people eventually get overload and turn off, and then you've actually damaged your brand?
That's one of the big dangers, Lindsay. For example, companies that use it as what we refer to as a broadcast medium. In other words, they only use it to shout out their special offers to their customers. They are going to damage their brand in social media. They will have certain die-hard customers who will keep following them, but most people will be turned off by that. So the idea is to engage with customers, and the way to engage with customers is to follow them back, firstly, if you are trying to build a relationship with a large customer base. And a lot of big brands won't follow back, and you can see they're only there for broadcasting. But if you follow back, it means that your customers can then communicate with you directly, personally as well. That also means you've got to have a team behind it. But you see F&B, for example, doing that very successfully. And the key, again, is that you have to be in a conversation with your customer and not just broadcasting to them.